Yeah,
Take care of
that's
I'm
good.
not taking care of you too.
Well, I appreciate it because I need the prayer and you need the practice.
Amen to that.
Okay, so we're finishing up John, and we're not going to review it in detail because it's been a lot of time.
Yes,
20
we
chapters.
reviewed it.
Yeah, but you know the basics, and we don't even, since we're not going to be, we only got one chapter left. There's no reason to talk much about the irony, and you know about how John uses irony, and you know the basic structure. John is unique among the Gospels, and that the focus in John tends to be Jesus as Son of God, and a lot of metaphors, a lot of images that's associated with that. All those I am statements. So when you look at the Gospels, and you have 4 of them in front of you, the John stands out as being different. You know, the other 3 you read and they sound similar, and they have a lot of similar stories. But John doesn't have a lot of those stories that we see in what are called the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John sort of stands alone, even to the point where Jesus spends 3 Passovers in Jerusalem. You know, in the other ones, he's only there once. The whole gospel is geared towards him moving to Jerusalem for Passover. That's not the case in John. So how he structures is a little bit different. Really focus on Jesus as Son of God, the divinity of Christ. If you want to know the humanity of Christ, we studied Mark, and that's the humanity of Christ. So the two kind of fit together like pieces of puzzle, but aren't identical. And we should never try to, I don't think, we should never try to blend them, because when we start blending them, we get a Jesus that's neither, you know, that's kind of an odd hybrid, you know, that we really don't need. I don't think it's very helpful to understanding who he is. So anyway, we're finishing up John. Now, last week we talked about what? What did we look at last week? Okay, well, not the crucifixion, because the crucifixion was the week before. You weren't here last week, so
He
I
arose
was
from
here
the
last week.
dead.
I wasn't here for the crucifixion.
Oh, you were?
We were here for the resurrection.
you were here for the. Oh, I thought you.
I didn't get him crucified. I only got him raised.
Oh.
I left early.
Yeah.
Oh, you left early. That's right. You left early because you got really mad about Thomas. I got you. I remember that. Yeah, right before Thomas, you left in a huff.
Come back this week. I was in
Yeah.
such a slip.
I'm sorry. You're right. You're here. So we talked about we did crucifixion, and then we talked about resurrection last week, and there were certain things with the resurrection that Jesus did, and we don't need to worry about the Mary Magdalene, that business. But what was sort of the key things with the resurrection? What did the resurrection, how was that important, particularly to the church later?
Because he sent his disciples were going to go out.
Okay.
And they were the ones who were going to preach.
He gave them the commission.
Yeah, and they had the Holy Spirit.
And if you look at commissions, same commission that Jesus gave in Matthew 28, you know, when you go, make disciples of all nations. Same commission he gave in Acts 1, the, you know, kind of the Lucan story, where he says, proclaim me in Jerusalem and Judea, and then Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth. Or rather, Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So, same commission. We got a commission here in the Gospel of John to go out. And what's going to enable them to accomplish that commission?
The Holy Spirit.
The Holy Spirit. And we have a very different Holy Spirit coming than Pentecost. And that's a great example of why we probably want to let the stories be distinct. Yes. Because if we put what Jesus did with the disciples and breathed on them, this very personal, but calling out all this Old Testament business, you know, that we see links to Genesis, where the Spirit is communicated through breath. You know, that's kind of important, but very, very intimate and personal. We've got that story. If we say, but later they had Pentecost, you know, when he came again. You know, now we get something that's odd. You know, why would Why would you need
Do you
Pentecost
think that's-
after this?
Do you think that's because John wants us to have a personal
I think so.
relationship with Jesus Christ so that he made the conversion?
Right. Well, I do. And I also think he wants to communicate to the church later that this personal communication with Christ is still happening. Jesus is still breathing on the disciples. And how John sees the Spirit seems to be a little different than Luke. For Luke, the Spirit is sort of independent, and goes where it pleases. The Spirit, comes, goes, leaves. It seems to be an independent force. In John, it's more, that
God control.
Yeah, it's ruach. It's that which gives life. Right, just like God breathing into the clay, the dirt. That becomes the Spirit that energizes us, and therefore when we receive it, we don't lose it. It doesn't go. In Luke, the Spirit is independent. Seems far more independent in movie. It doesn't mean one's right and the other's wrong. It just means they have different perceptions of what the Spirit is.
The writer.
Exactly. And the Spirit is incredibly intimate to us and fills us and enables us to do what we do. But the Spirit is also this powerful force that is controlled by God and does God's will. So, both are is God. So both of them are really true. But we don't want to, if we blend it, then it becomes one thing sometimes and something else something other
Isn't that
times.
like trying to blend physical and spiritual, and it doesn't jive well because it's not the same?
Yes. And I think a great example, and then we'll talk about it, I think a great example is some of the stuff with creation and evolution. I am personally offended when someone talks about creation as a theory. That offends me. Because by its nature, by definition, theories can be disproved. I mean, that's what a theory is. It's something that, in fact, when I present a theory, as the person that presents it, I don't do more experimentation to prove my theory. I do more experimentation to disprove my theory. And so theories can be disproved. Creation is a question of faith. And to bring creation into the realm of science, I find offensive because it reduces, for me, the power of creation and almost the mystical power of creation, because we reduce it to something that is profane being physical. And so let's not do it. Let's not in a class present creation as another theory. Creation as another theory. It isn't. That's a matter of faith. It's not a matter of science. It's a matter of faith. And so, when you try to combine them, and I'm going to make creation scientific. No, don't do it. You're doing something. You're not helping science, and you're doing something horrible to creation. Yeah. So let's not.
With any miracle of God,
right?
You can't explain it physically.
Right. I had a good friend of mine, and he passed last November. So I buried two very, very good friends in the last year. And he and I would have this discussion all the time because he was very rational and scientific. That was his perspective. And he would say, well, scientifically. And I said, well, John, you're right. I can't argue with you. But we're not talking about science. We're talking about faith. We're talking about a reality that encompasses science, that surrounds science. Science is part of that, and I'm not. Yeah, and right. But it's also included. Science. It's all around, and that's okay. And I recognize since science is grounded on theory, science changes. What we assume in the past isn't what we assume now because theories are disproven and new theories replace them, and that's a good thing. So let's not do that. For me, let's not do that. I think you're doing a disservice to God and this wonderful truth that we have. Okay, so anyway, we've got him, and remember last week, and Donna didn't hear it because she had stormed out already. And now. Okay, we kind of came to a conclusion, right? Well, we did. Yeah, you know that. I wasn't asking you, but I appreciate you answering. We came to a conclusion, right? What looked like the conclusion of John at the end of chapter 20. Because he seems to, all of this was written so that da-da-da-da-da, period. Okay, we're done with John. But then we've got chapter 21 that sort of picks up again. So
It's like an etc.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that makes him consistent because when he was at that Last Supper,
Yes, he ended it 3 times. One of the things, and I think I always hesitate saying stuff like this because I don't want to take it wrong, but I think you know me and trust me enough that I can say, just because you've got something in the gospel doesn't mean, and these writers are brilliant. I mean, they are absolutely brilliant, but sometimes their style isn't great. Mark's grammar in Greek is really bad. Really bad. It's not well written. Very awkward. And the other evangelists, when they tell stories that are in Mark, because I think the other ones had Mark, they kind of smooth it out. If you read the business with John the Baptist and, I'm not worthy to unfasten his sandals. The other gospel, Luke and Matthew, which talk about it, very smooth. They smooth it out. Mark is a mess, how he describes that. It's just a mess. Because he was awkward. Wasn't skilled writer. Brilliant theologian. In my opinion, probably the best of the 4. Brilliant theologian, but really an awkward writer. One of the things we see in John, and John is baby Greek. John is really easy. His Greek is really easy. I could sight read John. Luke is hard. Luke is really hard. But John is really easy. But John is also a little awkward. He concludes 3 times at the supper, and then adds something to it. The Mary Magdalene at the tomb is very awkward, what he's doing with her. And that's okay. Just because it's awkward doesn't mean his style is awkward, doesn't mean his theology is what he said. He doesn't have to be perfect. God did not dictate this to John.
An interesting thing is that everybody marveled at Jesus, who was uneducated. Well, his disciples were the same.
Yeah,
They
absolutely.
These fishermen, you wonder if they could read or write or
Sure.
what their education level was.
Well, I will tell you, and we're going to see this next week when we start Romans, and I think it applies here. Although the evangelists, since they're writing much later, the evangelists probably wrote it. Shouldn't take a half step back. Remember, papyrus was very expensive, and you had professional scribes who wrote, who would write it because they could get a lot of words in a small space. And so Paul dictated. We're 100% sure Paul dictated because he says at the end of Romans, I'm writing this myself. See how big the letters are. So we know he dictated. And when you're dictating something, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. I doubt that Mark dictated because if he did, he should have gotten somebody else to write it because it's a mess. Certainly Paul did it, and Paul, and he could write Greek because he says, I wrote this, myself, so he could read and write Greek. And
he was very educated, came through the system. We know that he was one of Gamaliel's students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And Luke's Greek is incredibly sophisticated. It is maybe, but we know he was educated just by his style because he uses Greek grammar in ways that nobody else in the New Testament does. He's hard. He's hard to translate.
When he described it when they were writing them, how many people would be able to read what they wrote? I mean, who were able to read? How many people did they expect to read?
Well, they expected a lot of people to hear it. They didn't expect a lot of people to read it because most people didn't read it. We're living in a world where most people are illiterate because there was no need to read it. I mean, this is people didn't start learning to read it. Literacy didn't increase skyrocket until movable type was introduced. Because two things, and Dan and I talk about this on you had perfect historical storms, and you had a perfect storm. When movable type is introduced in the middle of the 15th century, at the same time paper is being introduced from China. Because before then they were writing on vellum, or papyrus, animal skin, or papyrus, and you didn't have a lot of it, and it was very, very extensive. All of a sudden from China you got paper, and paper is really cheap because you can make it from fiber. When that's being introduced, you have movable type. Now, did the two things go together? Well, of course they did. But you had this perfect storm. So now you could produce books. And once you could produce books cheap, now people had the opportunity and incentive to read. At the same time, they had gone through the Black Death that had wiped out, a third of the population of Europe, which is horrible. But the people who survived were eating better because there were fewer people to feed. So all of a sudden, they were producing roughly the same amount of food, but fewer mouths to feed. Lord have mercy. You had a population that didn't have to work as hard as it used to. Now with paper, movable type, you had more time to read. You didn't have to spend all your time working. You had maybe an hour a day where you could do something else. And so people started reading. So literacy starts going up. But here, whatever was written here was intended to be read. It was read out loud. And a scribe would write it and a scribe would read it. And that's why scribes were known as experts of the law, Jewish scribes, because they were the ones who read the law out loud. So if you wanted to know what the law said, you go to them because they could read it in the text and tell you what it is.
Don't you find it amazing then that Jesus could read the scrolls?
Yes, absolutely.
Really?
Absolutely.
Would you be surprised if Jesus could read?
Oh, I think so.
Well, yeah,
given his background.
because education wasn't an important part. The fact
Or
that
at
he
least
could
literacy
read it
wasn't important.
was not what surprised me. That he could read the scrolls because he told them what to write. So
I just meant because he was, the Son of God, he would be able, before anybody else, he would be able to.
Well, but that's a good point. The fact that he could read it meant that he had an education that most people didn't. Now, again, want to emphasize, these people were not stupid.
No,
the people living here weren't stupid. They were, they knew math. They knew how to farm. They knew how to treat people who were sick within their limits.
Yeah,
they just didn't read because they didn't have to read. There was nothing to read, so you don't learn how to read when there's nothing to read. I mean, gosh, we can read everything. We got all kinds of opportunity, although that may be changing in the future as more and more things become digital and we have to read less and less.
Hasn't it been pretty much through history that when there was too much of something would come along, like a plague or like some sort of disease that would wipe out so many, and sort of like weeding out a little bit, and then so
absolutely. Big historical changes always occur at perfect storms. Mm-hmm. You have 2 or 3 factors working together, and all of a sudden you have this massive change. But when it's only one factor, you don't have it. Yeah. You need more than one and coming in different areas. And all of a sudden you have this massive change. And we've experienced, during our lifetime, we've experienced it. The communication changes in the last 20 years is right up there, I think. The introduction of movable type. Yeah, in the 19th century. Yeah. It's just discovery of coal, being able to change iron to steel, all of those things. Just you got a perfect storm. Rise of capitalism and reformed faith. I mean, all of that led to this. Okay. Anyway, so we're here. We got chapter 21. We're going to deal with chapter 21, and then we're done with John. Right? Okay. At the beginning of chapter.
Everything that he's written so far.
Yes. And then we'll look at Paul in Romans, and Paul in Romans is very different than John. So in the beginning of chapter 21, what happens?
Jesus appeared at the Sea of Tiberias. Okay,
we got Jesus appearing at the Sea of Tiberias. It's kind of interesting. Sea of Tiberias. What is the Sea of Tiberias? Galilee. Thank you very much, because that's what it is. It's the Sea of Galilee.
Why do you think you use that term?
Well, because Why would it be called the Sea of Tiberias?
Is Tiberius a ruler? Who is Tiberius?
Oh, excellent. Excellent question.
I
You know,
have-
excellent question.
I have a question.
Tiberius was the adopted son of Octavius, who was also known as Augustus Caesar.
Not
And
too bad.
so, so when Augustus dies,
You gotta name it after.
Tiberius becomes the emperor, right? So Tiberius is the second emperor of Rome, and when you have the emperor of Rome, what do you, if you want to suck up to him, what do you start doing?
Change his name to...
Change the names. Street names change. You know, lakes change. You know, that's what. That's why one of them. We're gonna run in Acts. We run across a ruler called Herod Agrippa, and which is a kind of an odd name because Agrippa is not Hebrew. But it was extremely popular because Agrippa was the general who defeated Cleopatra and Mark Antony in the Battle of Actium, and so people were naming. And since he won the battle, people were naming their kids Agrippa all over the place, you know, because it was suck it up. If he'd lost, they'd been naming him Mark. A lot of Marks running around, and Cleopatras, you know, because that would have been a little different. Okay, so we've got, but it's the same lake. It's the same lake. They're just calling it Tiberias. Good night. The Romans' capital city in Palestine was called Caesarea. Duh, why Caesarea? Because you had Caesars. You know, you'll rename your city anything to suck up to the Caesars. Okay, so being near the Lake of Galilee, there was another miracle that occurred near the Lake of Galilee. Right at the beginning.
With the fish.
Even way at the beginning. Chapter 2.
Oh, you're talking about the beginning of John. I thought.
Beginning of John.
Okay.
The calling of the disciples, was it?
Yeah.
Didn't he have to throw out the net on one side of the boat and get all the fish?
Well, hold on that. Hold on that. Because the wedding at Cana.
Okay.
Remember the wedding at Cana in Galilee? Close to. Okay, so we've got this occurring sort of in the neighborhood. Ooh, let's file that away. You know, we just file that away. We may need it later. Okay, and we've got at the wedding of Cana, what ends up happening?
Water to
Water to wine, and you have an abundance, right? You have change of water, so you have this wonderful wine and an abundance. Okay, so we get this miracle that occurs, and what is just a summary of the miracle, then we'll kind of take it apart. What is the miracle here in Galilee? Just in a nutshell.
He did wine, bought them wine when it was.
Are we now or at the wedding?
No, the wedding we're right now.
Right now.
Right now.
Yeah.
What is the fish all night?
Yes.
Fish all night.
And they didn't catch anything.
Didn't catch anything.
And so the dude on the shore says.
Dude on the shore.
Yeah, because they didn't know who it was. Throw your net on this side. They
Right
said,
side.
oh, what does he know about this? So we did, but they did it anyhow.
Yeah.
And they couldn't pull in the
Had so many fish you can't pull it in.
and the
Similarities.
net didn't break.
That didn't break. Similarities between the wedding and Cana. Ooh, both dealing with abundance, both happening in the same place. That's why we kind of filed it away. So maybe we got another story that has a point dealing with abundance. You know, because he's done it before. Told another story that deals with that. Okay, so let's kind of take it apart a little bit. Who was present there? So we got guys fishing. Who does John tell us is present?
Simon Peter.
Okay, we got Simon Peter.
Thomas. Nathaniel.
We've got Thomas.
Nathaniel.
But Thomas, what do we know about Thomas now?
His name.
He's a believer.
Yeah, he not only is he a believer, but remember last week?
Doubting Thomas.
Yeah, the doubting Thomas. What ends up happening to Thomas?
He believes.
Not only does he believe, he makes the most complete and theologically correct confession.
My Lord.
You know, my Lord and my God. Nobody has said that until Thomas says it. And so Thomas, we already have in chapter 20. Who else is there?
Nathaniel.
Okay, Nathaniel. When did we see Nathaniel?
He's from Cana.
What's that?
He's from Cana.
Yeah, and Cana is in Galilee. Ooh. And when did we encounter Thomas before? Nathaniel before? When was the
Andrew's brother? Was he Andrew's brother? Wasn't he one of the first ones?
Well, he was. Remember what happened?
Fig tree? No.
Oh, he was under the fig tree.
He was under the fig tree.
What can anything good
Yes,
come
nothing good could come from Galilee and Jesus. So we've got two stories from chapter 2 that seem to be pertinent here. So if John were going to tie up his gospel, this is not a bad way to do it.
No.
Because he's calling on these stories. And it doesn't mean these stories are dominant. But, we got this abundance deal going on just like a Cana, same place. Same people mentioning. Nathaniel hasn't been mentioned in the whole gospel until now. And he didn't have to be mentioned. Because there were other disciples that weren't.
There weren't.
Yeah, there were plenty that weren't. But he was. So it's like John tying up his gospel by bringing back some of these things from the second chapter. And remember, do you remember what Jesus said when Nathaniel you called him Christ? And you remember what Jesus said to him? Because Jesus said, I saw you under the fig tree, and I know you're a man of honor, and yada yada. You remember? And Thomas said, and Nathaniel says, you knew that by what you saw? And Jesus said, Nathaniel, you're going to see greater things than this. You're going to see greater things. And what is he about to see? Greater things than him. Yeah, greater things than that. Okay, so, we're kind of tying up things. Now, what does Peter say? What does Simon Peter say? Okay, let's go. I want to go fishing.
Yeah.
Now, we want to be real careful here because it'd be real tempting. Fishing. Didn't Jesus call Peter and say, fishers of men?
Yeah.
Time out.
Mm-hmm.
Not yet.
That he didn't do it in John.
Yep.
That's what he did in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But he didn't do it in John. Didn't say anything about fishers of men. So we want to.
He's about to become the fisher.
Yeah, we want to hold off on saying, "Ooh, this is fulfilling what Jesus said." No, Jesus never said it in John. So we can't assume that that's lurking in the background because the reader wouldn't know that. The reader of John wouldn't necessarily know that. Okay, so Peter says, "Let's go fishing," right? And how do the others respond?
Oh, let's go.
Let's go. Now, immediately, we've got Peter presented as what?
The leader.
As a leader of the group. Remember, we had this little deal last week when we looked at the resurrection. Between Peter and the one whom Jesus, the other disciple, the one whom Jesus really loved. We had this little tension, little bit, between them. They both run, one's faster than the other, but one goes in and the other later, and so we want to kind of file that away. But here he's clearly the leader of the group, right? Because he says, I want to go fishing, and the others say, we'll go with you, and they get on the boat. Now, who appears? But what does John tell us about their fishing trip?
It was a bust.
It was a bust. It was an absolute bust. They got nothing. No fish. Verse 4, who appears?
Jesus.
Okay. Now, really interesting, because one of the things we saw in John is light and dark are a big deal in John. And when does Jesus appear? Early in the morning, at daybreak. The light is there, coming up. So,
And they still don't get it.
What's that? They still don't get it. But we the reader do, and that's the people John wants us to get it. He didn't care about the people in the story. He wants us to understand. So Jesus is there, the sun is coming up, but the disciples
Don't recognize him.
don't recognize him. Now,
Why don't they recognize
well, that's why we don't want to worry. We're not going to worry about what happened. Well, Shelley, that's a great question.
Yeah.
And if we were looking historically at
Yeah.
this and say this is primarily history, boy, that would be a question I don't know the answer. And we'd have to come up with some complicated theory. We're not going to worry about it. Because this story seems to have just kind of dropped down, doesn't assume any prior knowledge on the part of the disciples with Jesus appearing in the room. That doesn't seem to be assumed in the story. I mean, nobody says, we remember when we saw Jesus the other day? That doesn't appear here.
But isn't it a message to us that we don't see Jesus until he's ready?
That could certainly be the case. That's certainly something you could take from it, I think you could certainly take from it. That you kind of lose if you kind of try to fit the two together.
Yeah.
We want to avoid complex,
Yeah, I need the simple version.
We want to be simple. We want to do things simple. Okay, so he's there. What does Jesus say?
Got any fish?
Okay, first he calls them children, right?
Friends. Mine says
Well,
friends.
it's technoi is the Greek word, technoi. And technoi means children.
Okay.
So he calls them technoi. Now understand the translators translated it French because what they're trying to do is convey that personal relationship, which is certainly there,
Yeah.
but he uses the word technoi.
Okay.
What's that?
Because he's the father.
Because, he's kind of taking a parental or a paternal role with him. So, but not a big deal. Do you have any fish? They answer him, no. Now, and again, we're not going to worry about it. For them to be communicating like this, they got to be
Close enough to
relatively close. They're not in the middle of the lake. Lake Sea of Galilee is pretty big. So they aren't in the middle of the sea fishing. They got to be pretty close for them to be having this conversation. But we're not worried about it because John isn't worried about it. All we care about is they're having the conversation. Jesus says to them what?
Throw your boat.
Throw the boat, throw the boat, which was really hard to throw the boat. And they said that was in the
things are possible.
yeah, that was in another version. He said, throw the man. They said, are you serious? And he said, no, you misunderstood me. Throw your net
My
over
mouth's been all messed up all day.
on the other side. And it's because you've been using too many of those little sticks. And so cast your nets on the other side, and what happens?
They
Get all this kind of fish. Now, when you read that, everyone here. Now, if I were talking to another group, it wouldn't be the case. But y'all here should be experiencing deja vu all over again, because you have heard this story before. You remember when you encountered
On the
this
hill
story?
when they fed all the fish.
Well, oh, good. Oh, see, remember I was telling you, you're jumping ahead. That's exactly what I'm talking about. You're making a connection. I'm not ready for it. You're 100% right. We'll get there in a minute. I'm talking to you, but you're right. That's what I was telling you the other day. You're right on the mark. By the casting of the nets, right? Because when Jesus called the disciples,
They were fishing.
they were fishing, cast a net and the pole in. Well, so you say, oh yeah, that happened. I remember that. Well, you remember it because you know
That's the word.
the Gospel of Luke, because that's where it appears in the Gospel of Luke, where he tells same story. They're fishing, catch nothing all night. Jesus says, cast your nets on the other side, cast the nets on the other side, and they get
Fish.
ton of fish, and the net doesn't break, and they.
53?
What's
Was it
that?
100?
No, well, the number wasn't given. In Luke, it wasn't. In Luke, it wasn't. But this is the same story. Now we could say, well, it happened twice, but the disciples don't say, hey, remember, he did this before. Peter doesn't say, oh yeah. You're giving her coffee.
tea.
Oh, tea. Caffeine, yeah. She's going to be all hyper later.
It's empty.
She's going after that stick. But it's the same story. Now, I think what they've done is this is part of the tradition that Luke uses this story in the calling, and John uses this story
And the closing.
as a closing. And it doesn't mean that he did it twice, because then you got problems.
It means this is where it fits in John's narrative.
It fits in John's narrative. John believes it fits in his narrative here. Luke believed it fit into his narrative early. Mark and Matthew didn't know. Didn't know. Maybe didn't know it, didn't give it.
It's interesting, because in Luke's story, it begins the ministry. In John's story, it begins our ministry.
It really does. And in Luke's, when we got to Luke's story, it's directly related to Jesus and saying, I'm going to make you fishers of men. I just made you fishers of fish. I'm going to make you fishers of men. And so we say, oh boy, that's a wonderful symbolic act to reinforce that. He's doing the same thing here. He just didn't introduce fishers of men earlier. But I think that's exactly right. That's what he's introducing right here. Okay, so they bring in the fish. Who responds? And of course, the writer, who responds first?
The disciple.
The disciple whom Jesus loved responds first. And what does he say?
It's Jesus.
Yes, it's the Lord. So we've got this little deal. Peter's the leader, but the disciple whom Jesus loved seems to have greater insight, greater faith. Same thing happened at the tomb. He was the one that believed first. And again, he's the one that recognizes first. Okay. And how does Peter respond?
You gotta get dressed and then jump in the water.
Okay. He gets dressed and jumps in the water because, of course, as everyone here who's been fishing knows, you fish naked.
Oh,
right?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, y'all do that here. That's why I've never allowed. I've never been into fishing
Excuse me,
because
he was in his underwear.
Well,
He put on only his outer garments.
yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Oh.
Absolutely. Oh yeah. Absolutely.
I didn't know they did fish naked. Where does it say that?
Well, where have you been? Everybody fishes naked.
Oh,
That's part of
man.
fishing.
Man, that's
It's not. This is
the lore of it.
at least that's the way we did in Virginia. Yeah. Let me tell you about crabbing. That's a whole different story. Okay, so we've got. He gets dressed and starts to shore. Right. He jumps in the water. And this has gotten out of control, and it's my fault, and I apologize. But I think we get a contrast to the personalities of the two, because the one whum Jesus loved, he says that is the Lord, and Peter said, "Hot dog, let me get some clothes on and jump in the water," which seems odd that he's going to get clothes on to jump in the water, But people did things different back then. Maybe he was wearing a Speedo. Maybe. I don't know.
You would think if there was a bunch of people around on shore and they're naked. I mean, what if there was women around or something? Didn't they care?
Nudity wasn't
a
thing until later.
This is what it says.
Yeah,
No. This is what it says. The point you make is really good, because one of the things the Jews were real sensitive about was nudity. The Jews were. Mm-hmm. The Greeks were not.
Oh.
The Greeks were not. But because when the Greeks, at their gymnasiums, everybody was
half naked.
No. They weren't half naked. They were naked.
They were all naked.
You look at the pottery.
Yeah.
Based on the athletic competition. They were naked. Or as we say, naked. And you naked. You had public baths. And they weren't wearing swimsuits in public. So they had a different view of nudity. In fact, it's just a tiny little story. As you look at Pilate, and I told you, as it's presented in John, Pilate is a person that seems to have sort of a proto-faith, pre-faith, but doesn't come off looking real strong, because he's manipulated by the crowd. Pilate, that's not the Pilate of history. Pilate of history was a big fat jerk, and that's why he got fired and transferred. Well, he was transferred. He wasn't fired, transferred. One of the things he did, because the Jews were real sensitive about nudity, and they didn't like when the Greeks, when Alexander the Great and the Antiochus ruled Palestine. One of the things that triggered the Maccabee revolt, there's several things. One, putting the statue of Jupiter in the temple caused problems. But The Greeks built a gymnasium in Jerusalem because that's what the Greeks did, and they were naked when they were in the gymnasium. But Jews were very, very sensitive to it. And one of the things that Pilate did, because he just liked to tick the Jews off. He just liked to tick. I mean, he marched into, the Jews did not like the Roman standards, the eagles on the poles, because they were idols, graven images. And so every other governor, before the cohort entered the city, the Roman soldiers, they would put their eagles aside. And in Jerusalem, they would enter the city without their eagles. But not Pilate. No, he marched his troops in with the eagles, which made the Jews, the Sadducees, the Zadok, the righteous Jews, really made him mad, really irritated him. One of the other things Pilate did that really made him mad is Jerusalem had a wall, was surrounded by a wall. And you had soldiers, of course, stationed on the wall. And what Pilate did was he had his soldiers, the guards on the wall, he instructed them not to wear any underwear as they were stationed around the wall. So when the Jews down below looked up at the Roman soldiers, they saw the moon all the time. And it really ticked the Jews. And he did it just to tick them off. There was no reason for him to do it other than he was just a jerk. And that's what Pilate was. And so the Jews hated him, constantly complaining about him. And the Romans did not like that, because they wanted money. And when people complain, that means they're not paying their money on time. And that's why they kicked him out and transferred him and replaced him with Felix. So this is, what you said about naked.
Yeah.
As a good Jew, Peter would probably not. He'd have been more sensitive than to be buck naked. Mm-hmm. But John is clearly writing to an audience that is
used to it.
Is Greek. Is influenced by the Greek. So they don't understand. Remember, he's had to define Hebrew words. They really don't have that same appreciation or negative view of nudity. He's writing to a different audience. Anyway, but that's a minor excursion. So they get the other disciples on the boat, and they what happens?
They catch a whole lot.
They got a whole fish, and they do what?
They tow it in.
Okay, they tow the net in, and what's going on shore?
They're getting ready to cook dinner.
Yeah,
breakfast, whatever.
Yeah, breakfast. Jesus has got a little fire, and John says it's going to be fish and bread. And now, Shelley, what's going on? This brings back memories, right?
Mm-hmm. When he did it on the hill, brought all the fishes and the loaves.
Yeah, boy, this miracle of feeding 5,000. We got the same sort of thing. So, if this is a way to tie up his gospel, this is a pretty good way to do it. Because in these stories, he's pulling out all these other incidents, as you hear it, as you think, oh, that sounds like.
Did you say that John wrote his after the other ones?
Actually, John probably wrote it at about the same time. It was after Mark. But it was probably the same time as Luke and Matthew.
Some of the stories from Mark, so that it all meshed together for the reader. And when they would hear the other part, they'd say, "Oh yeah, now this is all coming together."
Yeah, and I think there's some evidence that the evangelist John may have even had Mark, because there's enough Mark and stuff in John that he may have been familiar with the Mark narrative. He just chose to change it. But there are a lot of parallels. The parallels are with Mark more than with the other ones. So anyway, Jesus is there with bread and with fish. So we got a pretty good idea of what Jesus is going to do, right? Mm-hmm. What's he going to do? He's going to feed them, right? Because that's what he did before.
And 153 fish.
Yeah. What does he do?
They would have.
What's that?
They would want to know because it was a bigger haul than normal. 153 fish.
It was and I'm going to tell you something. I don't know the significance of the number 153.
That's why I said that they stop and count it.
Well, it clearly has some significance.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that is important for us to remember is that in this ancient world, certain things had meaning that have no meaning now. Have no meaning now. One of them is numbers. they put a big stock in numbers. And how they evaluated numbers wasn't necessarily, and I don't know, maybe this is a prime number. I'm not sure. Could be. I haven't worked it out. Could be a prime number. Prime numbers were really big for Jews because they reflected ancient people, because they reflected perfection. A number that could only be divided by itself in one. They became really special. That's why 7 is important. 3 is important. Those were important. But numbers had significance. They don't have significance to us. We don't. The only significance is sort of what we apply to it, but they aren't that important. They were in the ancient world. And so what the significance of this, if it's a prime number, that would make sense.
It might
153.
have been bragging rights.
Could be. Well, the numbers, that's why in Revelation, when you look at Revelation, man, you got numbers all over the place. And they don't signify 4 heads. The 4 means earthly, because that's what 4 meant to Jews. She's drinking coffee. She's going, she's going after napkins. Okay. Yeah, I don't want her hooked on caffeine.
Oh, thank you.
All right. So anyway, they get all the mirror, they get all the fish now, and the net isn't broken. If now Jesus or John is introducing this fishers of men business, what might this represent to the church later?
How you bring in your people to you.
Okay, bringing in all the people, and the net doesn't break. So you bring it.
That means you can have as many in the body as you want, as God calls.
Well, it's also very interesting. When Peter gets on shore, what does it say he does to the net in your translations? What does it say he does to the net in verse 11?
He dragged it.
Yeah, okay, dragged it. The New Revised Standard that I'm using says haul. Yours says drag. Really, really important that the Greek word used here, translated dragged or haul, was used earlier in John. And it was used in John 6:44, when Jesus says, "No one can come to me unless drawn by the Father." Same Greek word. Same Greek word. He says, and I, again Jesus, and I, when I am lifted up from the earth, this is from chapter 12, from the earth, will draw all people to myself. Same Greek word. Same Greek word. So, now you've got this connection. That if we knew Greek and we were working with Greek, we would know it. But in English, you translate it 2 ways. So you read it and just say he's pulling stuff on up to shore. But it's got this significance that's maybe greater than a guy dragging fish. This is what Jesus said was going to happen. People were going to be dragged or hauled to me. Same thing Peter did with the fish. So in a sense, this is starting. This is starting, symbolically starting with this net full of fish. And they have their
Breakfast.
They have breakfast. And none of them ask who he is because what? They know it. And he gives them breakfast. He gives them the fish and the bread, which has strong communion kind of images here. Okay. And this is the 3rd time. Nice little break in verse 14. So we go to 15 and we got this little break. Something new is starting. Yeah.
Well, here when he calls them up, he feeds them. I mean, he gives them the bread, sort of like communion. He gives them the bread and the fish.
It's a wonderful communion image, which we also saw in the feeding of the 5,000.
Yeah.
Because he blesses the bread and the fish and distributes it. And same sort of thing is happening here. Now in verse 15, we've got a conversation. And what's going on after breakfast?
Jesus talks to Simon Peter.
Talks to Simon Peter. And yeah, we got this thing working. This wonderful thing with the language going on here that we lose in the English. We lose in the English, but you can pick it up in the Greek. He's talking to Simon Peter, not a shock, because what have we even in this chapter seen about Simon Peter? He's going to be the leader. Simon Peter is the leader. And so he may not have the greatest faith, but he's the leader of the group. And as the conversation goes, this is sort of a 3-parter, right? Because Jesus does what?
repeats himself.
Yeah, to repeat. Do you love me? Simon says,
Yes, I
I do. Then Jesus says something. Then Jesus says, do you love me? Simon says, yes, I do. Do something. Then he says, do you love me? Simon says, yes, I do. Do something, right? We got this 3-time exchange. Not a shock that it's 3, because things coming in 3s are good.
Well, Peter's hurt too.
Well, he
In a
is.
way, because he asked him so many times.
But it's kind of an interesting thing when you look at what's going on, at least in the Greek. Because each time Jesus, at each exchange, Jesus tells him to do something a little different. What we don't see in the English, because it's love, yes I love. Love, yes I love. Love, yes I love. But that's not in the Greek. That's not in the Greek. Jesus uses the word agape. When he says, do you love me? He uses the Greek word agape. Now, agape in the New Testament, there are 2 Greek words for love that we translate love in English. And I mean, we translate them both love. And the Eskimos got 40 words for snow. They had 2 words for love that we translate love. And one is philios, or phileo, which means a verb versus a noun, which means liking, friendship, but also love between husband and wife. It's an emotional love. It's not eros, which is the other Greek word not found in the New Testament, which is a more base physical love. But philios is a word that refers to love between 2 people. Brothers have philios love. That's why we call it Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. That's a good Greek, 2 good Greek words. So it's an emotional kind of love. It's kind of like, only more intense. And then agape, though, is different. And agape love is the one that is talked about a lot in John. That's when Jesus uses love. He doesn't use philios or phileo. He uses agape. And Paul uses agape.
Is that supposed to be the greater love?
Well, it's a different kind. For the Greeks, it's a different kind of love. You might call it a greater kind if you believe that the difference makes it greater. Agape love is more like showing love. That's more like. If I...
Diane showed us.
Yes,
agape love,
yes,
bringing
yes.
us our treats.
Yes,
That was agape
that would be more an agape love. If you are loving toward someone,
Okay.
that is agape, which means you can show agape love to people you don't like. You can't show filial love to someone you don't like because it's emotional. I mean, that's an oxymoron.
Yeah.
You can't do it because that infers that you like them. So agape love is something that's active. It's also then based on decision. We decide to show agape love. We don't decide to like someone. It just happens. But we do decide whether we're going to treat them in a loving way. And when you look at Paul's great chap, 1 Corinthians 13, which probably came from another source, because it doesn't necessarily fit well between 12 and 14. You got this wonderful chapter on love. You look at all of those and is patient. Yeah, I can choose to be patient. Kind. Yeah, I can choose to be kind. Is it envious? Yeah, I can choose not to envy. All of those are actions that we can take. We control. So agape love, we control. Now, when Jesus says the first time, Peter, do you love me? He uses the word agape. And when Peter says, what?
You know it.
You know I love you. He uses the word phileo. He uses the word philios. He doesn't use the word agape. When Jesus asks him, do you love me? He's talking about the kind of love that is shown by action. When Peter responds, he says, and when I've translated this before for churches, when I've preached this passage and used my own translation, because you can't use an English translation, I will say, Jesus said to Peter, do you love me? And Peter says,
I like you.
you know I like you. You know I like you. Because that's really what Peter is saying. Now, that's not strong enough. Because, liking seems insufficient. But it's emotional. You know I emotionally love you. And that's what Peter says. And Jesus says what to him?
Take care of my sheep.
Where he says, feed my sheep.
Do an
And
action.
that's really important. It's an action.
Choose.
Okay. And it's feeding sheep is you've got to work at it. You got to go there. You got to go to the pen and do it. So second time, Jesus says,
Do you love me?
do you love me? He uses agape then. And Peter says, you know I like you. I don't know why you keep on asking, because you know I like you. And Jesus says,
Take
care of my sheep.
take care of my what?
Sheep.
The first one.
Feed his lambs. It's feeding lambs.
Yeah,
The first one is feeding lambs. The second one is taking care. So feeding lambs is more challenging than feeding sheep, right? Because you got to deal with lambs. The second one is tending sheep, which is more than just.
It's like herding cats.
Yeah, if I say to you, I'll feed them, but man, I'm not going to chase them down in the field. I'm not going to do that. And I am not going to, I don't want to, will you take care of my dog? Well, how old is your dog? Well, she's 8 weeks. No, I'm not going to feed an 8-week dog. I'm not going to get a bottle and, no. If she's 8 years, I'll do it. But I ain't going to do that. That's hard. So both of those times, feeding lambs and tending sheep, that demands real commitment. That's hard. So when he says, do you love me? Twice, Peter says, I like you. And the command that follows what Jesus says is both times demanding. Third time, and this is what I love about it, Jesus says to Peter what? Do you love me? But now Jesus has changed the word. Now he's changed it to Philippians. Yeah, and so Jesus the third time says, do you like me? Do you really like me? And that's when Peter gets hurt and upset. You know I like you. Heck, he should know, because Peter's done what? Told him he likes him twice. But now Jesus is saying to him, do you like me? And then he says, what does Jesus tell Peter to do? Feed my sheep, which is, of those three,
The easiest.
by far the easiest. You're not feeding lambs. You're not tending sheep.
You just gotta take them to where the grass is.
That's right. All you have to do is, but you're still doing something.
Yeah,
you're still doing something. So it's not like, okay, you're kind of, that's enough. You're still doing, the call is still doing something here.
But like Peter says, he says, you're Lord, you know all things. So he has to know that,
Yeah, that's right.
I love
What do we do with this little exchange? Particularly knowing this word change in the Greek. What is John communicating to the church later? Because remember, he's writing this for a church 60 years after this is occurring.
That we have a choice of how much we do.
Okay, that we have, because agape is always a choice. And twice Peter said,
Lord, I love you.
I like you. But he didn't say, I'm gonna be loving. But I'll like you. So twice he did that. So we've got that it's a challenge to be active in your love. And if you're going to be active in your love, sometimes the jobs you're called to do
Are nasty.
are nasty and demanding. And yet that's what Jesus called Peter to do twice. And Peter didn't do it. Peter wasn't going to do it because he liked Jesus. But he didn't love him. Wasn't ready to love him now. So twice the choice. Now, but what about the third time? Because Jesus changes the word. He doesn't say, do you love me again? And Peter says, yeah, I like you. And then Jesus said, Jesus changes the word to conform to what Peter has said. And Peter doesn't change in this. Peter never changes in this little exchange, but Jesus does. why might that be really important to a church leader? Why might it be really important to us? And I think it is absolutely crucial to us.
Is it because that even if we can't show the action, as long as we love Jesus, there's hope for us?
Yes. Agape is a decision. Agape love is a decision. I have to decide to love. It doesn't come natural. Being patient doesn't come natural. It's something you got to decide to do. Being kind doesn't come natural. Jeez, we talked about that in worship. Jesus says, that's not part of your nature. That has to be a decision. We have to decide to do it. Agape, Peter's not ready to decide. And if we decide to do it, Jesus tells us what to do. Feeding lambs and tending sheep. Which, by the way, when you say tending sheep, geez, that's bringing back deja vu all over again. I am the good shepherd. So we got all this sheep language, shepherd language that Jesus has already given. So what then are we, what are we doing? We're going back to this story, and we are sort of taking Jesus' place now in the world, since Jesus is back with the Father. So we become this representatives of the shepherd. Remember? We said, and in that parable, he talked about two kinds of people. Not the thieves and the robbers, because that was the first half. Then he talked about the good shepherd versus the hired men. And the hired men do what?
They have to take care of
They take care of the sheep. The hired men take care of the sheep.
They're not as dedicated.
But they're not as dedicated. They're not going to lay down their life for the sheep, because it belongs to somebody else. I'm not going to die for somebody else's sheep. I'll die for my own. Maybe. But I am going to die for his. I think it's really fair when we bring that story into this. We've got 2 times Jesus says, you need to be like the shepherd. You need to feed lambs. You need to tend sheep. You need to decide you want to love. You got to make the decision. But Peter never makes that decision. What then becomes the significance of the third little exchange? When Peter, you said, we're building on that. Yeah, that the third one is, even if you're not ready to make the decision to love, and all you feel towards Jesus is an emotional connection. And liking, like I said, is too weak. It's stronger than just liking. But I mean, what other English word would you use? I don't know what it is, what word it is. Even if you never get past an emotional connection to Jesus,
It's okay.
It's okay. You can still do something. Doesn't mean that we stay there. Doesn't mean that, okay, that's fine, you can live your life, and you shouldn't even strive for anything more. We should be working to love. Make the decision that we're going to love the people around us. When he said love one another as you've been loved, he used the word agape. He didn't use the word philios. He used agape. So the goal is agape. But even if you're not there yet, you can still do something.
I think the interesting part about agape is that once you make that choice, then you really don't do anything. God does it all through you.
Yeah.
And he brings in this little bit here, it's sort of like he brings you from the beginning of your life to the end of your life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's stages.
I love
Transformation.
what he does here, because this becomes a message to the church. Because we're churches, we're so tempted to do this. Unless you, and ministers, geez, we're worst of all. Because when we're preaching, unless you, no, you got to do this, Now, we may not be doing it, but you should be doing it, And what we've got here is a story where Jesus says, it's almost like he recognizes Peter, you're not there yet. And you can still be a hired hand. You may not be bringing the other story in. You may not lay down your life. You may not lay down your life for me.
But
That
it
may
says
not.
up here,
But-
eventually you do.
Yes, that's right. Eventually you will. You could still, for all those people that haven't made, unable to make, or willing to make that decision. Willing is better.
Yes.
Not willing to, because it's a matter of the will, not anything
It's a
else.
choice.
If you're not, you could still have a role to play. And you can still feed sheep. Lord have mercy. That's a powerful message for Christians later. Doesn't mean y'all have to, everybody has to be here. Man, there's a whole spectrum.
I think it's also a transformation that, we make. Our hearts have to be changed. First we accept, and then we obey, and then we live.
Well, and when you think about the living, these aren't sort of markers. Well, that I'm living. Now I'm living. Because it's constant. It's a constant decision.
It's a constant choice every day.
Yeah, love is deciding to be patient every single day.
Every time.
Love is deciding to be kind every single time. Which, when you think about it, and this has just kind of hit me, is really the theme in John in general. Because our relationship with God is right now. You may trust Him today. You may not trust Him tomorrow. But you could trust Him the next day. And that's kind of what John, I think that becomes kind of a theme that John has worked, and he takes it and applies it to love. I think this is brilliant. This is wonderful theology that you kind of miss because when you read it in the English, it just sounds repetitive. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense why Jesus would do it 3 times. But when you look at the Greek, man, a lot of stuff is going on in the changes of the word, which is, again, typical of John. John loves to play with words.
But it's like, in all of this, if you're growing, you, as a person, as a follower of Jesus, you're growing as this is going on. Mm-hmm. And there's days, well, like you said, you aren't real strong on.
That's right. But it doesn't mean you're outside. No. And it doesn't mean you're outside.
Yeah, you don't stop.
Right. And he does remind Peter that what's going to happen to Peter?
His death.
You are going to lay down your life.
And this is
you are going to lay down your
life.
life.
He said, "Follow me."
Yeah.
To Peter.
Yeah. Well,
twice.
Well, isn't that our command every day?
Yeah, follow me. Yes.
So it's good that he repeats it because every day we have to make that choice.
Right. And that's again a choice, just like love. It's constant. It's not a matter of, I've decided to follow, therefore. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about making that decision all the time. And so we've got him dealing with Peter. And then I think Peter, the conversation sort of shifts and it deals with an issue that was present in John's church. And I don't think it has much relevance to us, but it was a big deal in John's church. What starts happening in verse 20
Peter wants to know what's going to happen to the one he loves the most.
Yeah, this guy, the one you love the most, and if you don't remember who he is, he gives him a little talk, right? And it's John telling us. It's not part of Peter's thing. It's John identifying him. Oh yeah, it's the one that reclined by Jesus and asked who was going to betray, right? And what does Peter say? What is Peter's deal?
What's going to happen to him?
What's going to happen to this
him, if I'm
this
going
guy?
to go through this, well, how about him?
Okay, yeah. And what does Jesus say?
If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?
Okay, but then he follows it with what?
Yeah. Oh, you must follow me.
Follow me. Which he had just said. It's not kind of. It's sort of like what Jesus says in Acts. When they say, the disciples ask, how will we know when you're going to come back? And Jesus says, nobody knows. Don't worry about it. This is what I want you to worry about. Sharing the good news in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. That's your job. Your job is not to worry about when I come back. Your job, Peter, is not to worry about
what
that guy.
What else is doing?
That guy. Now,
our job too.
Right, and John tells us why he's included this, right? In the next verse, what is the rumor was going around?
John's going to make right.
That this one disciple is going to either live forever, but in what sense? Well, how could he? I had a friend of mine who was really nervous. His father was a dental surgeon, and he had to have dental surgery. And my friend was really, we were young. I mean, when you're young, you don't have surgery a lot. A lot of us did that. We didn't have surgery. And he was really nervous about surgery, and particularly about being put under. and his father, and it was going to be done in the office. And so my friend was really, really worried about his father doing the surgery. And his father would say to him, because my friend is telling me, Dad said, if I had the surgery, it'll last a lifetime. The surgery will last a lifetime. Oh, well, you sure, Dad? Because I don't want to go through this again. It'll last a lifetime. And after he had the surgery, I was talking to Steve. His name was Steve Carroll. And I said, how did the surgery? He said, I don't want to talk about it. and I said, well, why? He said, I really don't want to talk about it. I'm really irritated. And I said, well, why? And he says, I was really worried about the surgery, getting the surgery. And I said, yeah, I know you were. And my father said it would last a lifetime. You wouldn't have to get it done again. And I said, yeah, you told me that. He says, I was in my father's place, office. And I was about to go under. He was about to put me under. And I asked one last time, Dad, are you sure? Is this the right thing to do? And this is what my father said. He said, son, this will last a lifetime if you die at 34. And he said, then I went under. He said, that was the last thing I remember before I went under. So when he says here about living, the rumor is John would live forever. It's not live 2,000 years. John would live until what?
Till he died. Till
Well-
Jesus set his time.
Of natural causes.
Whenever he wants them.
Well, John would live, he would be alive when, well, true, and that's right. That's kind of what he suggested. But the rumor went around, and you can still see it in some scripture, that John was going to live and see Jesus return. Jesus' return would be in John's lifetime. So as long as John was alive, Jesus
couldn't come back.
Jesus might. He could come back anytime.
Okay, he would come back.
Paul could die, Peter could die, everybody else could die. But as long as John was alive, Jesus is going to come back any minute now. And then John dies. And if I believe that for 20 years, that as long as John is alive, Jesus could come back, and then he dies, then I'm thinking what?
Well, is he coming back at all?
Maybe none of this is true. Maybe none of it. Maybe it's all baloney.
But
And that's what
telling us it's a rumor says it has no
it has no validity. And evidently he's addressing a rumor, that's being circulated that John was going to live, or whoever the beloved disciple was going to live forever until Jesus returned, which would be forever.
Well, yes.
Would be forever. And John is telling us, don't worry about it. Worry about what?
Now.
Following me, loving one another. That's what you need to worry about. Okay, so then how does he end this?
What I said's true.
Yeah, everything I wrote was true, written down, and if I wrote everything I knew,
We wouldn't have enough pages.
wouldn't have enough pages. Would fill hundreds and hundreds of books. And now we've got John ending
Again.
for the second time. The first ending probably was a little more dramatic. But this was written so that you might have faith, and And this one is, well, if I'd written everything I know, I would have been even a bigger book. Would have been like War and Peace, Les Miserables. It would have been this huge book that nobody reads. But here it is. And so this becomes the Gospel of John. What are some things that you can take from the Gospel of John? And just briefly, because some of y'all are going to storm out in just a minute. And okay. All right. Well, that's good. I didn't want to upset anybody. What are some of the things that we can take from the Gospel?
Every day is a choice.
Every day is a choice.
Walk in the light.
Walking in the light. Walk in the light.
Follow Jesus.
Following Jesus.
Believe.
Believe.
And love.
And love. And what kind of love?
Agape.
Boy, because I really
No,
like, I really like all of you. But agape love. Okay, good. Well, this is the Gospel of John, and if you leave with those things, I think that's really good, and I think that's what John would want after people read his Gospel. I think that's probably the conclusions he'd want them to have. And now the challenge is
It
doing it.
makes John 13:34 and 35 all that much more poignant.
What-
John 13.
What is that?
A new command I give you, love one another, for I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another.
Sure. Yep, that,
Well,
like
that's not
that old camp song.
And that's not always the easiest thing either.
You're right. Because love,
Again, it's a choice.
loving one.
Yeah, yes, but what I'm saying is that it's not always an easy choice.
Oh, no, it's not.
Because there's some people, to be honest, and I could be that for somebody else, I don't know, that for some reason you just can't connect, you just can't, and it's hard. So I don't think it was meant to be particularly easy.
Christianity is about loving folks we don't like.
Yes,
And that's really where the rubber hits the road.
yeah.
It's loving people we don't like. And Jesus even says it. If we love only people, well, Paul said, not Jesus, Paul said, if we only love people, he'll say it in Romans. We'll see it in Romans. If you only love people that you like, or if you're only willing to sacrifice for people you like, what does that mean? You already like them. The challenge is sacrificing for people that you don't like.
Yeah.
The challenge is to love God, love your neighbor, love your enemy, love those who persecute you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Negative things.
that's right. Which will change. I know will change my attitude the next family reunion I go to.
You ain't like your brother.
I love my brother. I do love my brother. My sister, but my brother, I like her. I really do.
Is your brother still handsome?
He should be getting older.
I'm glad you asked that, Patty. Two things with my brother, both involving hair. First, his hair is getting gray. I have not one gray hair in this head. Here, but not here. And second, and this is another contrast between us, which is really, so I have no gray, he's starting to get gray in his hair. The other thing is, my brother is starting to lose some of his hair.
I just
You're not.
Different. So,
yeah. Look how happy he is about this.
what's that?
I said, look how happy you are.
Yes, I am happy. I am happy because I'm not yet losing my hair.
No, you already lost it. You don't have to worry about it.
Now, was that loving?
Yes, it's a loving truth.
Bald is beautiful. That's right.
It's a loving truth.
To tell the class, Paul.
And it is. There's a lot of brain work going on here.
Well, that's why
You know.
you go bald. The brains build up and it takes up so much room, your hair falls out.
You believe that?
Of course I do.
Okay, that was a loving thing to say. All right, let's have a word of prayer. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time together. Thank you for the Gospel of John. It helps us to see Jesus in a new and exciting way. And so help us, remind us that we are filled with your Spirit, your breath, that Holy Spirit. Remind us that each and every day we can make the choice to trust, to believe in you. And when we believe in you, we get a taste of eternal life. And challenge us to love one another. Not just like one another, but to actually be loving and kind and patient towards those around us. Help us to do that, because in doing that, we're sharing your love with others. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen.